1. Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. This is Jim Hansen sitting in for Frank. We're going to spend the next hour digging into the most pressing national security issues. And if you enjoy my particular take, there is quite a bit more on Twitter at Uncle_Jimbo. President Trump ran on a platform saying he would defeat radical Islamic terrorism. It was a signature issue and completely differentiated him from President Obama, who did everything in his power to whitewash the Islam out of the issue. But it's not quite that simple, and any strategy to defeat it must take into account the terrorists and their supporters, but also the hundreds of millions of Muslims who don't share their beliefs. Lieutenant General McMaster, who is our new national security advisor, made some statements about the nature of our enemy that have some folks concerned. Specifically, he said terrorist organizations like Daesh or ISIS, who cynically use a perverted interpretation of religion to incite hatred and justify horrific cruelty against innocents. Well, the bottom line is he's correct. Burning people alive in cages and slaughtering thousands for the perceived crime of not being devout enough is perverse and barbaric and uncivilized and not accepted by the vast majority of Muslims worldwide. Those acts are evil, and we can all join together to condemn them. But I don't think General McMaster's statements are inconsistent with President Trump's formulation and description of our enemy. So to join the two, you can accurately say radical Islamic terrorism is a perversion of Islam. This accounts for the fact that the horrible savagery of ISIS is not compatible directly with Islam, but it also accounts for the fact that it is conducted by Muslims and in the name of their view of Islam. The prestigious Islamic university Al-Azhar in Egypt is the foremost proponent of what is and is not Islamic. And when they were asked whether ISIS was Islamic, they famously refused to declare them outside of Islam, and they said, "No believer can be declared an apostate regardless of his sins." That essentially puts them in the position of saying love the sinner, hate the sins. The leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has a PhD in Islamic studies, and Al-Azhar, in making their statement, had to take into account some of its own curriculum, which, and I quote, allows for killing a Muslim who does not pray, one who leaves Islam, prisoners and infidels within Islam, gouging their eyes and chopping off their hands and feet, as well as banning the construction of churches and discriminating between Muslims and Christians. Not quite the level of barbarity of ISIS, but still pretty awful. And this is the gold standard for Islamic thought. So we cannot and should not completely detach Islam from those who put these concepts into action. Which brings us back to the question of how to refer to our enemies. General McMaster has done more than almost any other U.S. military leader to co-opt former enemies and even members of terrorist groups into joining us in the fight against those groups. He has rightly noted that a blanket denunciation of the religion of Islam as the cause of all this is unhelpful in the cause of turning our enemies into allies or frenemies at best. He also rightly notes that we cannot kill our way to victory, but we must enlist the help of Muslims who don't wish to follow this return to the 7th century religion of conquest. But we also must accept that support for the supremacist ideology of radical Islam is considerably more widespread than just the terrorists. Radical Islam is a global threat, and any strategy to confront it must address its violent elements and also its ideology, and include a way to enlist the help of the many Muslims who don't share those beliefs. This enemy is a peculiar and challenging type. It has no central headquarters, is not run by a single rogue state, or comprised of one identifiable network. It has elements that are sponsored by states like Iran and Saudi Arabia, and even has one quasi-state entity in ISIS. But it is not one enemy or alliance that we could conduct a war against. That said, we must accurately identify this enemy to be able to successfully defeat it. So let's do that. In this case, there are two interconnected elements. The first of these is the groups that are all too familiar to all of us: ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the rest, the usual suspects. There are many more, and they will rise and fall, so it's more important to note their beliefs and tactics rather than their names. And it should not be controversial to anyone that these groups are evil and should be eliminated. But these groups did not spring up in a vacuum. They represent a strain within Islam that believes in conquest and has declared itself at war with those who do not share its extremist beliefs. Now that includes non-believers like us, but also many Muslims who it considers insufficiently devout. They have no compunction about killing anyone who does not submit to their view of the will of Allah. Now there's a second tier of believers who may not agree with the barbaric tactics of ISIS or Boko Haram, but who nonetheless share the view that Islam must be spread and become preeminent. They also agree that some level of violence, even against innocents, is acceptable in that pursuit. This is a not insignificant number of people. Now, if we have resolved to call these violent groups radical Islamic terrorists, then it is logical and accurate for us to call those who support them and their belief system in some way radical Islam. The number of Muslims this includes is difficult to accurately gauge, but we can get a good idea of the huge scope of the problem from the Pew International poll of Muslims worldwide. Support for the violent groups varies from country to country, but even the low estimates are in the 5 to 10% range, which is 100 to 150 million people. There is considerably more support for those who say the expansion and consolidation of Islam is good and required, and again, even the low estimates of that put it at 20 to 25%, which is 300 to 400 million people. Those folks are okay with violence in support of their cause. And in this poll, Pew was unable to conduct polling in some of the most militantly Islamic countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, because their pollers might have gotten killed. So these estimates are almost certainly well on the low end. Now, in their most recent major poll, they went ahead and asked one question that I think identifies just how widespread this problem is. They asked, some people think that suicide bombing and other forms of violence against civilian targets are justified in order to defend Islam from its enemies. Do you personally feel that this kind of violence is justified? Now, the answers came out in never justified, often, sometimes, or rarely justified. Now, the answers were so stunning to Pew that they actually cheated the system and took the answer of violence against civilian targets is rarely justified as a negative response, as if those people had said, no, I don't agree, it's justified. No, they just said rarely, which means they'll decide when, and then it's okay. So when they published their results, they skewed them by adding that to the never justified to make the poll look less heinous. The actual number of Muslims in this poll, and this was 39 countries and 38,000 people, was 28% believed that in some way, shape, or form, violence against civilian targets in support of Islam is okay. That is scary. That can't be ignored, and that shows that this problem is not just the terrorist groups. There are a significant number of people who have decided their way of life and ours are incompatible. They cannot coexist with us or the rest of the free world. Additionally, they want to dominate the Muslim world.